Okay, all right, we're ready to get started. This was the paper for this week, by the way, for those who've just walked in. It was on decoding visual perception through MEG data, which is very similar to how EEG data works. French people, hopefully we'll invite this guy here, Jean Remy, to come speak. Really, really good speaker from the conference that I saw him talk about, and hopefully he will be down to come yap to us about what he does. Okay, all right. That's the end of the presentation. As a quick preview for those that are interested and do zone off halfway through, these are the events that are coming up next week. So tomorrow we have the intro talk for the wheelchair project. So that's going to be in Dyson level 1, but I'll put that in the main group chat, like the exact details on the day. On Tuesday is the onboarding project. So for those who've signed up to that, it will be kicking off next week. And then next week is probably our biggest talk of the year, the most exciting talk of the year. For those who know what DARPA is, it's like the US's government's research arm. So it does sort of like, I don't want to call it risky, but it's not safe investments. They try and reach towards like the cutting edge of applications and research together. The UK kicked off their own version of that called ARIA last year. And the program director of the Precision Neurotech program of ARIA is coming to speak to us and is so unbelievably fascinating. He's got a physics background, he's done quantum computing for many, many years, and knows literally the cutting edge of everything Neurotech related. So please come ask him your questions. He's a very, very friendly man as well. But yeah, that's going to be here next week. That's just for those that are interested. Also, we have a podcast out now, but I mean, I'll cover all this at the end. All right. I have a GIF, which I'm excited to. Also, the slides will be on GitHub as well. Once this is finished, I kind of wish I uploaded them before because there are links, but hopefully you can still enjoy it without clicking through everything. Perfect. All right. Welcome. Take a seat anywhere. Happy Halloween, everyone. Happy Diwali as well. This is Neurotech 102. So it is an introduction to Neurotech series. So it's not going to be postgraduate neuroscience for those that were hoping that, unfortunately. My name is Anish. I'm one of the presidents of Imperial Neurotech. This is Aisha. She is a KCL student who does neuroscience, who is the president of KCL Neurotech. And this is our Halloween edition. Okay, so let's get into it. Main point of the workshop, should I start a timer so I know how long I'm doing this for? Okay, the main point of the workshop is really just to understand the brain. We're going to start with simply how many calculations the unconscious brain does. Like as every single person is sitting in this room, your brain is doing billions of processing units at any particular time, and it is useful just sort of to have an appreciation of that. The second is the basics of neuroscience. Obviously, I'm not really going to be covering that because I'm not a neuroscientist. And then third, philosophy of mind, which is one of my favorite fields in academia. So we will talk a little bit about what the mind-body problem is. Perfect. So unconscious mind. So let's do a little imagination example. You're sitting with your friend with your friend together in a coffee shop. You're chatting to them and you notice them lift up their cup of coffee and take a sip. It's so unremarkable. You don't even blink. You don't even look at it. You don't even really register what's happened. But what has happened is trillions of electric impulses have been coordinated meticulously and have gone by completely unignored. They're not even consciously aware they're doing it. So that's why it's called the unconscious brain. So this is a very, very wordy slide. If you want to, you can brave it and read everything. There's a lot that is going on. We'll go through it in a little bit more depth, but basically very simple pipeline. Your visual system is scanning and seeing what's going on. Your memory system is informing exactly what you need to do in that situation. So you know when you see a cup of coffee and you quote unquote volitionally want to touch it, that you will go out and grab it. Obviously, there's a lot of precise muscle coordination to move every single joint in your arm to move there. As you touch it, you have feedback coming back from your nerve cells, and those are going up the spinal cord into the somatosensory cortex. You are coordinating all this information, you know, where it is in space, the temperature of the cup, the slippiness of the cup, everything back down to your arm, making micro adjustments, and then you move it up to the lips, sip a little bit, and the entire time you're not even aware you're doing it. You might be, for example, changing the muscles in your throat to speak. You are producing words at the same time. You're thinking about something else. All of that is happening genuinely, completely subconsciously. I sort of want to hark on that point, so I'll go into like a lot more depth as to literally what is going on. People aren't going to read this slide. It makes me sad, but because I spent a lot of time with it. But I hope people can appreciate when they look back on the GitHub slides how much information is on these slides. But yeah, so briefly, if we're going into sort of like the cognitive neuroscience as to your cognitive abilities, how are they matching up to your neural mechanisms? We're talking about the object recognition part of your brain. So that is the what pathway, we'd say. that is from your primary visual cortex at the back, is determining all sorts of things like the shape of the object, the color of it, and then obviously identifying that it is a cup. Then you have lots of other neural pathways that are considering how far away that is, distance and depth are synonyms, so it's not kind of redundant. But it is sort of these processes, but binocular disparity is your two eyes are two different points in space, and so they technically get different angles of the object. So you have to think about how they match them together. And then obviously the motion of the cup, the motion of view, size perception, all this comes into play. And that is literally just recognizing the object, as I say. This is a very fascinating field in its own right. Then we're talking about some motor planning. So you've got your premotor cortex. All these terms, well, I mean, some people, you would have heard them a million times. Some people, it will be the first time. We'll go into more depth as to what they are. This is a workshop designed for people who've never heard of neuroscience before even. So we will hopefully cater to people who have just, day one of Imperial and they're wondering what the hell's going on. So the premotor cortex is planning the movement. Your supplementary motor area is coordinating your joints, for example. Your prefrontal cortex is making decisions. Your basal ganglia is where a lot of the nerves in your body are housed, is doing your sort of smoothing of that motion. Your cerebellum is doing more fine motor control, and also handling some of the proprioceptive feedback, which is what happens when you touch it. When we're talking about that feedback, we can talk about the sensors in your fingers, for example, sending signals back up the spinal cord to the somatosensory cortex. And we integrate all this information together subconsciously, instantaneously. And for those that see this and their eyes glaze over, I assure you, every single one of these problems is something someone could devote their entire life to. And forget about the idea that this multisensory integration is something called the binding problem, is an open question in neuroscience and philosophy. People don't know how your sensors, how your sensory systems get integrated together to form a single experience. And if someone has a theory on that, write a paper. The binding problem is an open problem. The binding problem is not.
Like with language, right? That's you integrate like the visual stuff and sounds to, let's say, read, right? I think there's something that we can do.
I'd say neuroscientifically, we understand how different modalities sort of interact with each other, like the same as how, like, for example, a transformer model can do image and text in the same model. Like they sort of combine them in some mechanism, but I think the means in which we form a single unitary experience from all these separate streams is an open question. But we can discuss it at the end. Don't worry. We can get into. We can go to the union after. We can discuss it all. Don't worry. Right. Brainstem again. More brain terminology, postural control. All the different things that we sort of don't even think about when we talk about what we don't even think about. There's another level to that stuff. And then we're talking about facial muscles and throat muscles, how they interact with the cup. Obviously when you drink it, things you don't think about in the slightest. But trust me very much, when any of these abilities get taken away, you notice it very heavily. And all the time while this is happening, you have awareness of what is going on around you. Oh, I should have made the Figma. I can't see my notes on the slide, so I'm going to be winging everything, I'm afraid. Maybe they're on your thing. Like, if you show me the Figma, there might be some notes for some of these things. But yeah, exactly as I said earlier, while you're doing this, you are aware of your surroundings. You're thinking about, you're just aware of if a loud sound happens, what's going on. If you see someone running towards you, you know what's happening. All of this unconscious information is happening in synchronicity with a lot of other things. Perfect. All right. So we'll move on to the brain terminology. I think when we start off talking about the brain, we need to talk about how we navigate it, much as the same as how we navigate a map. So maps have their north, south, east, west. They have their two-dimensional compass. In the brains, we have 3 dimensions. So front, back. You would call that the anterior and the posterior. In other animals, you would call this the rostral and the caudal. So caudal is Latin for tail. So that means, like, for example, in a tailed animal, you would say this towards the caudal end. That's front and back, top and bottom, superior, inferior, also called the dorsal and the ventral. I think the best way to really get this is for you yourselves to, like, ask yourself, do I know what direction that is? And that's the superior direction, for example. And then when we're talking about left and right, we don't actually use the terms left and right. We actually determine how far towards the edge it is, because it's sort of like a mirror image. A brain is sort of 2 hemispheres stuck together. So we don't say something's on the left, we actually say something is towards the edge of it. When it's towards the edge, it's the lateral surface, and when it's towards the middle, it's the medial surface. Not a hard and fast rule. Medial is ambiguous. It's used in other contexts as well. So as an example, there is a part of the brain called the medial temporal gyrus that is not in the center of the brain. It's actually on the surface. It's on the lateral edge of the brain. But it's called the medial temporal gyrus because it sits between the superior and the inferior temporal gyri. So the fact that it sits between two other things is what makes it medial. Medial doesn't inherently mean center as it does here. And then let's quickly talk about cross-sectioning the brain. So you can slice the brain in all three dimensions as you would expect. When you slice it vertically but through both hemispheres, it is called a coronal cross-section. When you slice it vertically but through one of the hemispheres, i.e. this way, it is called a sagittal cut. If you do it directly in the middle, i.e. through the corpus callosum, I believe.
Corpus callosum.
Oh, so good. It's called a medial plane, medial slice. And then when you do it horizontally, it's axial or medial. Any questions on the brain locations and everything? All right, get ready for a brain dump because we have a neuroscientist now to talk about all the different brain structures. So I will take a seat. Please welcome Aisha.
Hi everyone. So first of all, forgive the glasses, are not really very true to my historical outfit. But in terms of you guys, could I get a show of hands? Who has done, I don't know, A-level biology, for example? Okay, perfect. We got some novices in here. Okay, cool. Has anybody done anything beyond that? So any sort of like undergraduate study or postgraduate study at all? Okay. All right, cool. Did you want to explain the levels of knowledge?
Oh shit. Okay, yeah, sorry. Oh, sorry. We welcome Anish. Okay, so basically I've just done a brief scale so that people know roughly what information is sort of relevant to you, of like increasing levels of difficulty. What are we talking about here? So number one is a novice, someone who's never even heard of neuroscience, no idea of the terminology. Hopefully a lot of the information here will be useful. Number two is someone who has high school biology, is an enthusiast. I mean, I'd probably put myself in this category in terms of understanding neurostructures, but not necessarily having any sort of formal education in it. Number three would be an undergraduate, so someone maybe doing a neuroscience, biology, bioengineering course, understands synaptic transmission, basic brain regions, et cetera, et cetera. Number four, I've put, we only reach up to three in this presentation, I should say. This is an introduction to neurotech, introduction to neuroscience, sorry, it's not really a postgraduate class. But those, for example, in category number four, would, have a much more deeper understanding of the brain, probably an entire formal education in neuroscience alone. And number five is really an expert. So obviously, hopefully some of the speakers we normally get would fit in this category. They're probably proficient in neurochemistry, neurophysiology, neuroanatomy, all those different things. All right, take it away.
Okay, perfect. So even though the brain looks like it's just a massive meat in your head, it isn't. The first main bit that we'll talk about is the cerebrum. So the cerebrum is divided into four main lobes. So the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And it's also further divided into the right and left hemisphere. And that is joined by the corpus callosum. So yeah, frontal lobe is to do with decision-making, problem-solving, planning and motor function. The parietal lobe processes sensory information such as touch, temperature, and pain. The temporal lobe is associated with auditory processing, memory, and language comprehension. And the occipital lobe is to do with visual processing, as you would think. Below that, we have a funny-looking structure called the cerebellum. It's at the back of the brain, beneath the cerebrum, and it coordinates voluntary movements, balance, posture, and is involved in motor learning. A little side note about what motor learning actually means is obviously we have different types of memory in the brain. The main distinction that we make is between basically physical learning that you do with your body and, when you're learning for a spelling test or for an anatomy test. And the motor learning would be that sort of subconscious, very physical level of memory. And the cerebellum is very important for that. Next, we have the brainstem, which is, it's comprised of a few parts, as you can see there. The midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. It's essential for all functions, basically breathing, heart rate, any kind of homeostasis. And so all kinds of control of heart rate, all of your nerves go through it. It's very, very important for that. As you can see, midbrain is to do with visual and auditory processing. The pons connects different parts of the brain and regulates sleep and arousal. And the medulla oblongata controls autonomic functions and reflexes such as swallowing and heart rate. Next, we have the diencephalon, which is more commonly just known as thalamus and the hypothalamus. They sound very similar, but they do slightly different things. My anatomy teachers would like me to think so. The thalamus acts as a relay station for sensory information involved in consciousness and alertness, and the hypothalamus regulates homeostasis, including temperature, hunger, thirst, and circadian rhythms. Next, we have the limbic system. We won't go too in depth with the limbic system, but essentially it's a complex system of structures, including the hippocampus, the amygdala, and parts of the thalamus and hypothalamus. So there is a bit of overlap there, which is why we won't worry about it too much, but it plays a key role in emotions, memory, and motivation. The hippocampus is crucial for forming new memories, while the amygdala is involved in emotional responses. The basal ganglia are a group of nuclei located deep within the cerebral hemispheres, involved in control of movement and coordination, as well as the regulation of voluntary motor movements, procedural learning, and routine behaviors. Next, we have the good old corpus callosum. So it's a large bundle of neural fibers connecting the left and right hemispheres, and it facilitates communication between the two hemispheres, allowing for coordinated functions and information sharing. Does anybody know the name of the surgery that divides the two lobes? No, that's not quite it. Do you have a guess?
I mean, it's
It could be. Yeah, I mean, you probably know better than me, but it's commonly known as a hemispherectomy. So that's when you would divide the fibers. The reason why you would do that would be, well, most commonly for the treatment of epilepsy. So it's thought that epilepsy is caused by misfiring on one side of the brain, and then it sort of influences the other side of the brain to do the same thing. And we have seen some pretty positive outcomes when we divide it down the middle. But it's probably the only notable thing about the corpus callosum at this stage. Next, we have the ventricular system. It's comprised of cavities filled with cerebrospinal fluid that cushions the brain, it removes waste, and provides a stable chemical environment for the brain because it is a very delicate organ. And fun fact, the ventricular system is incorrectly revered for 1,500 years as being the seat of thought, emotions, reasoning, and memory. We are still not quite at the core of what really is. So going down to a smaller level, the neuron is the functional unit of the nervous system. So all of you who have done A-level biology will obviously know that. It's responsible for transmitting information throughout the body via electrical and chemical signals. Over here, we have a lovely, very anatomical picture of a neuron. Essentially, the main functions are the cell body, which is a soma. Every neuron will have a soma, contains the nucleus, the organelles, processes incoming signals and outgoing signals. The dendrites are branch-like structures that receive signals from other neurons, and the axon takes these electrical signals and sends them away from the cell body. And obviously, we have various neurons that you find within the body. So motor, sensory, and interneurons are the most common sort of distinctions, but again, not super important right now. Significant for learning about how the body processes pain, touch, and how the brain, sort of coordinates responses is obviously the most important thing is to understand resting potential and then what an action potential is. So a resting potential is just the net electrical charge across a neuron's membrane when it's at rest. And that's typically minus 70 millivolts, but it is a little bit difficult to measure precisely. The way it works is that there are more sodium ions outside of your neurons than there are inside, and there are more potassium ions inside. And even though those are both positive ions, it does create a net negativity inside of the membrane. You also have a sodium-potassium pump in your membrane. So this pump actively moves sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell, helping to maintain that resting potential. Because as you'll see, if you don't have that resting potential, you can't initiate an action potential. And an action potential is, for example, let's say you, literally the touch in your fingertip, right? Your skin has this thing called the Pacinian corpuscle in it, which is a sort of transducer. It's a sort of sensory neuron. And it takes a stimulus and it turns it into a different kind of energy than what's been put in. And so there are different sorts of channels in the membranes for these neurons. So for example, if we're talking about the one that would be in your finger, it's a stretch-mediated ion channel. Does what it says it does. So the finger senses a touch, sodium would rush in, and you would have depolarization of your membrane. So because there's now more sodium inside, it becomes less negative. That continues until the cell membrane reaches about plus 35 or plus 40 millivolts. And after a brief moment, the sodium ion channels then close and potassium channels open. And that leaves a cell which starts repolarization, and it restores a negative charge inside of the neuron. But you do have a period just after this action potential of hyperpolarization. So sometimes too much potassium exits, making the inside of the neuron even more negative than the resting potential. This is a brief state before returning to resting potential, and it also gives the neuron a chance to just be inactive. This is also really important for the synapse. So every neuron has a cell body, and common misconception is that the presynaptic knob of a neuron is a cell body. That is not correct. It is just the end of an axon. So like we talked about, an axon takes signals away from the cell body. A synapse is a junction between two neurons or between a neuron and another type of cell. So like a muscle cell, which we would call the neuromuscular junction. It's where communication occurs, allowing signals to be transmitted from one cell to another. So we've had our resting potential, we've got our action potential going. And then once it reaches the end of your first neuron, say, that depolarization reaches the presynaptic knob. This is where I think it's voltage-gated ion channels are then activated. And you have an influx of calcium into the cell. This again depolarizes the membrane, obviously not with sodium this time. And that then causes the release of neurotransmitter via exocytosis. And I don't want to get ahead of myself here. So it causes the release of the neurotransmitter that then diffuses across the synaptic cleft, and it binds to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. And the receptors are actually on the ion channels for this axon. So it binds, and then the ion channels open, and then the depolarization builds up, and it propagates to, along the next axon, along the next nerve. And there are various ways that we terminate that signal naturally in our bodies. So the number one way is reuptake. Neurotransmitters are taken back into the presynaptic neuron for reuse. We have enzymatic degradation. So enzymes in the synaptic cleft break down neurotransmitters. Probably the most common and abundant one in your body is acetylcholinesterase. Diffusion is also a way that neurotransmitters are recycled. So some neurotransmitters are simply diffused into other axons or into blood vessels, depending on where the neuron actually is. So that's just like a quick rundown of the events. I'm pretty sure that that's all A-level biology, but it's very important, guys. It's important for everything in the brain. Hope you enjoyed.
All right, now very different. This is not neuroscience related at all, but this is, I'll be honest, probably the most interesting topic we can talk about. It's the philosophy of mind. So I don't know, Reach, has anyone done the philosophy of mind Horizons module at all? Yes. Has anyone done philosophy of mind in general? Wow. Okay. Right. It's gonna be new. Okay, let's get into it. So philosophy of mind is the mind-body problem. So at the core of the mind-body problem, there are two main questions. One is, what is the nature of the mind? And this is seems like a very short question, but there is a lot contained within it. The nature of can consist of, is it a substance? Is it just behavior? What is it, etc.? There's so many different things you can relate to it. And then the big thing is, how does it relate to the body? You have a mind and we have a body. How do they interact? Does one exert causal influence on the other? Do they interact at all, etc., etc.? There are many, many, many different schools of thought, and we'll go into all of them. And this is still an open question, I should say. If anyone manages to solve it, you have probably the most cited paper in the world ahead of you. It is incredibly fascinating, and will be the course of many discussions. And I encourage those who are watching this. This is going to be a massive knowledge dump. There's going to be a lot of information, and this probably should be like undertaken over literally an entire term of a module. So come to the union after and we can discuss it at the very least, or just read the slides and start doing some Googling. There are some sources at the end that might be useful. So one of the most infamous forms, I guess, and some would say it's completely dead, but it is still worth knowing about, is substance dualism. So this is come up with by a man called René Descartes, who came up with sort of a quote called "Dubito, cogito, ergo sum." So I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. And it is just mainly the idea, I mean, he extends this, that's not the entire saying, but he goes from this sort of very beginning foundations to the idea that the mind and the body are different substances entirely. And now the manner in which he does this is by presupposing a god. So he starts by saying that I am a thinking being. That's all I know, but there's also a god. So that also does this. This was the 1700s. So that was very much scientific thinking and was allowed at the time. I think as we advance more in philosophy, substance dualism sort of dies away, but I'm not saying kill it dead. You may think about it and realize you are a substance dualist, and I would encourage you to pursue it if you are, because there are many thinkers out there who still are. I put René Descartes, but there are many, many more. Another kind of dualism. So dualism is mainly the idea that there are two kinds of things out there. It's not just one kind of thing. We'll talk about monism in a later, well, in literally 2 minutes. But property dualism would say that your mental states are non-physical properties of your physical state. So they're dependent on them entirely. But you would say maybe the fact that you have an emotion is a property of the way that your brain is existing at that particular state of time. And it's a very interesting thought. And I would encourage you to look at that. Hey, welcome. There's another kind of dualism called predicate dualism, which sort of says that we assign different predicates to mental states and physical states. Again, interesting, worth looking at. Yes. I don't think he's asserting whether you can explain it, but I would say by the nature of the theory, yes, that they would sort of it's a form of non-reductive physicalism. It's non-reductive in that you won't fully be able to explain all the neural mechanisms causing this, but it is sort of physicalism in that that's the only real substance out there. Yes. Yes, yeah. I've lost the slides. Perfect. Monism. So monism is basically the complete other side of the coin, but there's not two things out there. There's only one kind of thing out there. And the most popular one, and one that a lot of scientists, and I imagine that most people in this room would subscribe to, is a reductive physicalism, that everything mental can eventually and will eventually be possible to be explained by physical processes. By saying that this neuron is firing, causing this neuron to fire, causing this population to do this, will explain every conscious thought, feeling, memory, everything that humans are able to do cognitively. A reductive physicalist would say this. And to some extent, it seems crazy to say now because obviously we don't know the answers, but a lot of scientists would say that this is going to be the case. And in the podcast that came out today with Andreas Schaefer, we asked him this exact question. Do you think that physicalism is all there is? Do you think that is a reductive world? And he said yes, and sort of inherently that most scientists that are doing neuroscience work right now would be agreeing with this. But open question, and many philosophers and neuroscientists would disagree. An eliminative materialist. Am I going to in depth? I don't know if this is fine. Okay, perfect. Eliminative materialist would talk about something called folk psychology. So much as we used to believe that gods control the weather, that you would say it's raining because Odin was pissed off today. That is something called folk psychology. It's something that we use in our language colloquially with each other, but doesn't actually exist. It's based on knowledge we don't yet have. An eliminative materialist would say a similar sort of thing, that something like a belief, for example, a mental state, is an example of folk psychology. It doesn't really exist. It's a thing we talk about colloquially and will eventually, if not right now, should be eradicated from our language. I mean, to what extent you agree is dependent on how much you sort of criticize our language being the cause of a lot of our issues. And I would really, really encourage you to look down this route because ordinary language philosophy is fascinating, and we'll talk everything about what the meaning of things actually is. That's a guy called Wittgenstein, but we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. But monism doesn't have to mean that everything is physical. Actually, this kind of monism, called idealism, says that everything is mental. It says that only mental things really exist, and we come up with the physical world around us based on what's happening in our brains. In our minds, I'd say. So that the physical world is actually just a construction of the mind. And I would also say this is a very popular belief. For those who are joining me from the Horizons class we just had, no, I ranted and raved about idealism, but it is popular thought. Functionalism is slightly different. It's another sort of non-reductive physicalism idea, and it's sort of that everything is defined by your functional roles, the process that you take part in. And it's actually Hilary Putnam in his Nature of Mental States. Sorry, I'll read out the titles because it's probably better just to hear it rather than just have it on the screen. But Nature of Mental States, he talked a lot about sort of treating the brain and the mind as sort of software. So he's actually very computer science coded, and is worth reading just for that. But yeah, it's a very interesting thought pattern and does make up a lot of modern AI functionalism research. If we talk about whether AI is conscious, we actually generally refer to functionalism by saying it does this role. But whether that means it's conscious is actually probably hinging on whether you believe functionalism is a real school of thought. Emergentism is one of the most interesting fields out there. What it actually is kind of hard to really sort of narrow down. I can come up with sort of two main schools of thought. So weak emergentism and strong emergentism. For weak emergentism, I would encourage the Rediscovery of the Mind by John Searle. And Searle has many arguments that are very persuasive, but it's sort of like that your consciousness emerges. So emergentism is this general idea that you have complex physical systems and properties emerge from it that wouldn't otherwise exist without their interactions. So simply you have, just as you have like wind flowing around in a hurricane, that becomes a hurricane. You can't just have the sort of rain particles on their own and call that a hurricane. You obviously need the complex interaction between them for it to emerge as that sort of destructive thing that it is. Much is the same as you have neurons talking to each other, and sort of your consciousness emerges from that. And the difference between a strong and a weak emergist would be that the strong emergist would believe that you can have unique properties from consciousness, i.e. consciousness, your mental states can exert causal influence on your physical body. It can go both ways, basically. Whereas a weak emergentist might not say that it can influence it per se. To what extent the limitation in that it's no causal. I don't think there's a no causal relationship, but it does limit it to some extent far more than a strong emergentist would. Panpsychism is one of the most interesting, and it's weird to call something up and coming in philosophy, but it is an up and coming belief. It's been around for many years. So Christoph Koch, sorry, I've got a very dry throat, so it's hard to say that, which is weird because it's half my surname. But here we are. Wrote this lovely sort of, it's an article. So sorry, I should say some of these are books, some of these are articles. So I'll quickly just go over which ones are books and articles. This is an article, so you can just find it online. It's literally like 10 pages, for example. This is, I believe, a book. This is obviously a book. George Berkeley, many, many years ago, 17th century philosopher. Putnam's is a book, and then article. Christoph Koch came up with something called the neural correlates of consciousness. He did that with Francis Crick, who helped invent DNA, and is one of the most interesting ideas is this panpsychist idea that sort of, it's almost saying it's a bit like idealism in that the mind is everything, but it's sort of saying that the mind is pervasive and the mind exists within everything. So that chair over there would have a mind almost within inside it. Where you draw the line, it sounds ridiculous to say, but actually I think you should probably read it a little bit more and delve into it before you dismiss it potentially. And he uses example of, looking at his dog and saying, well, the dog winces when it feels pain, and we can say what's causing the pain, etc. Is it conscious? Go down that route. It's a very, very big rabbit hole. And then I think this is epiphenomenalism. Epiphenomenalism, I'm sorry for those who I'm repeating this to, who I literally talked about this an hour ago with, but is sort of, if you imagine an example of steam coming off a steam train, the steam that comes off the steam train is produced by actions that are happening inside the train, but it does not affect the train at all. It is sort of like a ghost world that sort of doesn't interact with it. It exerts no causal influence down on the train. It's the same thing with epiphenomenalism, in that mental states are byproducts of physical states and do not influence them at all. There's no causal interaction there. I say this is the only philosophy of mine, one where I actually properly disagree with it, but it's like still a very widely held belief and is, again, up to people's beliefs. But I would say, for example, the fact that I could feel emotions influences how I behave. Whether I decide to leave a room is dependent on whether I'm angry or not. So there is potentially a case for causal influence, but some might get around it with other ways, but open question. So I guess the real question is, why the hell have I been talking about any of this? Why is this interesting? It's probably best to start with that before you launch into a knowledge dump. But Neurotech offers the perfect sort of merging of these fields. Neurotech is so cross-disciplinary that it reaches philosophy even, which no other engineering degree really does. So the point is that once you subscribe to a particular philosophical school of thought for philosophy of mind, you can start to delve and sort of answer questions about it as a scientist would, by poking holes and sort of doing physical experiments to see what's going on. So neuroimaging, something that obviously Neurotech is constantly trying to improve upon, offers a chance to really look at brain activity and not just say what's going on, but how it's going on. So we can start to analyze cortical columns, for example, to see exactly how certain bits of the brain cause certain things to happen. Now, it is not a be all and end all. Like, for example, you can come to the strongest conclusions that something can cause something. You can say this part of the brain is causing this person to be able to see, and then someone can have a lesion, have that part of the brain removed, and they can still see. And that can happen from a couple of different reasons. One, you prematurely said this causes this, and that's not right. But two, also the brain is plastic. Like because of plasticity, a new part of your brain can learn to do something that an old part of your brain did. It's not strict. Like when we were talking about the brain structures earlier, it's not that this part of the brain does this, only this, and it's the only part that could do this. You know, other things can learn to do it when you have parts of your brain removed. So the questions from dualism and physicalism ask us and push us to ask more questions and come up with more frameworks for the brain-computer interface systems. You know, the fact that we can say the brain is a functional system, for example, means we can design experiments to test this area of philosophy and this area of neurotech. There's a lot of crossover there. Anyway, I think that was actually the bulk of the talk. So thank you so much for guys for making it through. Oh, wait, actually, there's more resources. These are all things that I would highly recommend people look up. All these links are real links and will be in the slides, obviously. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is literally a go-to if you want to see a particular school of thought in philosophy, place to go. This is just a general introduction to philosophy of mind, very worthwhile reading. These are journals that publish quarterly. Well, this one quarterly, I think this one is slightly more regular. Really interesting, worth looking at what articles they've got on their homepage right now. The Aristotelian Society is based in London, actually, and has got lots of meetings that would be very interesting to people. And these are some things that I would consider Googling maybe. Neural correlates to consciousness is sort of the buzzword sort of in this field. I mean, to define it would be what is the minimum number of neural events that are occurring for a particular cognitive task to be performed. So let's say someone is going into their memory and remembering a childhood memory, it's trying to ask, well, what exactly is needed for that to happen on the minimal level, as in not obviously like an fMRI would measure all your brain functioning at once, and it would consist of many other things like you being aware that you're lying down or you remember what you had for tea. It's talking about genuinely what is the neural correlates of consciousness? What is it that is happening in the brain at the exact same time or gives rise to, the causal side is question mark, to that aspect of cognition. So really worth Google. As I said, that was Christoph Koch and Francis Crick. Rest in peace. Also rest in peace, David Chalmers. But I mean, he died last month. I mean, Francis Crick died 20 years ago, so slightly different. Philosophy of language. Wittgenstein talked about 2 different types of philosophy of language. I would encourage reading his, not Tractus, the other one. Philosophical Investigations, really worth reading. Heidegger, Being in the World. If you're interested in whether machines can be conscious, this is the place to start. If we're talking about what makes us conscious beings, Heidegger would say it's because we're embodied, because we have a body and we're able to move around and interact with the world. That is what makes us existing. He doesn't use the word conscious because it's a word that's riddled with so many different misnomers and uses in all different kinds of situations. Like someone would say the word conscious for a million different things. So it's useful to come up with his own vocabulary, which he did. And then finally, The Concept of Mind by Gilbert Ryle talks about something called the category mistake, which is fundamental if you want to sort of take down substance dualism. If you're finding yourself, look at your brain and say, shit, I actually think there might be a mental world out there that exists in a separate substrate. I would read about the category mistake and then analyze your thinking and think, oh, maybe I assigned mental state and physical state the same category when they were actually not at all. And then finally, these are some modern approaches. This is a whole summary of 4 major approaches to consciousness research right now. And these are 2 of the most promising sort of theories that exist currently. Whether they will become anything more than theory, up to say. So thanks for joining us. Oh, I've got more. We have a podcast episode out, so that came out today. That is with Andreas Schaefer. So those who were with us last year would remember he gave an excellent talk. He's an amazing speaker. And it is... I'm not gonna lie to you guys, kind of a bad podcast because the audio did not work. So we were recording purely off the camera that was recording it. And there was a lot of beeping in the radio studio, but it's actually a really interesting discussion. And he is a really, really, really talented speaker and is really capable of, you know, taking mine and Elif's terrible questions and sort of wording them in something that could genuinely be listenable. And then secondly, we have a mailing list now. So we have Jiwoo, our lovely secretary, set up a mailing list, which will post, you know, what we're doing for a particular month, events that are coming up, everything that people might be interested in. Obviously, we'll post more hackathon things now because that's coming up next. We haven't announced a symposium yet, but the symposium announcement is going to happen literally this week, I think. So hopefully that'll be coming out soon. And generally what's coming up for the next week. So tomorrow, this is open to anyone who wants to be involved. We have the mind-controlled wheelchair brief. So we're going to do that in Dyson. I mean, everyone was already here for the literally beginning of the talk, but for those who are new, that's happening tomorrow. There's a group chat for that. So if you join that, then anyone's welcome. Tuesday is onboarding project week 1. I don't know if people signed up for that, but the applications are closed for that, but that is going ahead. That'll be actually in the same room as well anyway. So if you go to both, then you already know where to go, guys. And then next week, anyone not here for my little ARIA blurb? Okay, perfect. Biggest talk of the year. Please come. He's going to be an amazing, amazing speaker. And we're very, very lucky to have him. Yeah, that's everything. Thank you so much.